Hello. Today I will go over the initial Pulp 3 pull request to add file creation and go through the different aspects of it. If you haven't already, I would recommend watching the previous video, which goes through this slide. It talks about different levels, different layers. We will refer to different aspects of this layout throughout the pull request overview. So going here, here's the pull request for adding Pulp 3 file creation, and I'll just step through it real quickly. Here is the Pulp selector class, which decides whether to run a Pulp 2 action or a Pulp 3 action. And so the way it was implemented is that it just takes a Pulp 2 action or Pulp 3 action or repository and a smart proxy, and then the rest of the arguments. And then it asks the smart proxy if there's Pulp 3 support, and if there is, it plans it with the same arguments, else it plans the Pulp 2 action with the same arguments. So here is our Katello repository create action, and so here we're actually planning the Pulp selector and then passing in whatever Pulp 2 action was decided upon, and then the Pulp 3 orchestration create. And actually, let me go to just this commit. Apologies. All right. There is one other previous commit that was required. Moving on, the metadata generation also has to be converted. Since this is part of repo creation, we generate the metadata of the repository, even though it is empty. And similarly, we're triggering the Pulp selector with a distributor publish for Pulp 2 or a orchestrated generate metadata for Pulp 3. And this one here takes in an options hash, as you see, because there's lots of various options. Here is our Pulp 3 abstract class, which the only thing it offers is really just the ability to find a smart proxy. Here is the Pulp 3 abstract class. It's very similar to the Pulp 2 abstract class, or abstract async class, abstract async task class, in that it has a bunch of waiting states, and then if we go down, it knows how to check to see if the task is done. It knows how to fetch the external task from Pulp. So down here, this pull external class method is calling the Pulp 3 API tasks read. And you see the Pulp 3 API depends on a smart proxy ID. This is pretty much required now. Otherwise, it's very similar to a Pulp 2 abstract async class. The one thing I would say is this knows how to handle the zest, which is the Ruby gem for Pulp 3 that we publish, the async operation response, which is the object we get back from asynchronous tasks in Pulp. So it converts it to a JSON if it is that type of class. Moving on, we have the Pulp 3 orchestration repository create task, where we're creating the repository create, the remote, the publisher, the version, and the oh, we've got a bug here. I will fix that. So we've got 4 actions: create, create remote, create publisher, and create version. Moving on to the generate metadata orchestration, we have a create publication, which is what actually generates the metadata, and then the refresh distribution, which is what either creates or updates a distribution, which is a published at path. And here we have the repository creation action for Pulp 3, and it's very simple. We'll go through these very quickly. It's just planning, looking up the repository and then calling the backend service create. Same for publication. The only difference here is that we have to save the publication onto the repository after we create it. So here we are planning the action, and then we are planning the save publication action. And as you notice, it's passing in the Pulp tasks from the previous action. So the idea is that this first action will run, and then the output from it will get passed to save publication. And here, this is just invoking the create publication backend service method. Moving on to the create publisher, it's very similar to repo creation, just looking up the repository and calling create publisher in the backend service. Next, create remote, again very similar, it's just calling create remote in the backend service. Create version, this is similar to create publication. It is planning itself to run, which calls the backend service for create version, but then it is taking the output from that and saving it onto the repository, and we'll look at both of these actions. Refresh distribution, very similar to the others, it's just calling refresh distributions on the service class. Now here we go, the save publication, very similar to the save version, which we'll see in a second. It is taking these input tasks, and it is looking for a created resources attribute on the first task, and then there should only be one created resource, because we're only creating one thing, and that gets saved on the repo as a publication href. And very similar in the save version, it is updating the repo to save the version href. And the variable here is publication href, but I'll fix that. It's looking at the right actual data. Next, we move to the Smart Proxy extension. So this is part of the Smart Proxy object. It is creating a Zest configuration object, setting the Pulp3 host, the username and password. This is very temporary. It eventually will move to certificate authentication, but for now we will use passwords, a debugging option, which we've currently set to true, and then configuring the logger. And the debug logging will be configurable in the future as well. So this gives us a Zest client. Pulp3 support, this looks up the repository type manager, which stores all of our repository types that are currently loaded into the system. It then looks to see if it supports the Pulp3 plugin, and if the Smart Proxy, if the Pulp3 plugin here is the actual name of the plugin for Pulp3 for this repository type. So then it checks in the capabilities, the Pulp3 feature, the capabilities of the Pulp3 feature to see if it includes that Pulp3 plugin. And then the Pulp3 host, this is the host name for the Pulp3 server, and it is coming from a setting on the Smart Proxy that is exposed from the Smart Proxy configuration. All right, moving on down, we've got a couple of active record models. These are very simple. We have a distribution reference, which basically just stores our distributions, the href for the distributions, the path, and the root repository. In addition, we have a publisher reference, which stores the, well, let's see what it stores. Well, actually, we'll go through it when we look at the database modeling. And then we have a repository reference, which is very similar, although some of this stuff is out of date. Yes, there is no publisher reference, so I need to delete that. So ignore publisher reference, ignore this has many here, not needed. So in Katello repository, we've updated the backend service method to again support checking if Pulp 3 is enabled and returning the correct backend service class. Here we have the Pulp 3 repository service class. This is a sort of an abstract base class. It doesn't really know how to do much. It does, let's see. So here we're creating a name for a backend object, and my thinking was it's better to be able to run something a second time and not have a conflict, especially when it would be sort of difficult to look up and find that conflict because it's referenced by some href, which we may not know about. So here we've actually introduced a little bit of randomization, and we may go via with a UUID or something like that. We're including the label and the ID from the repo here to help better with support identification. Here we're looking up the raw repository reference. As you see, we look up, we find one by root repository ID and content view ID. And then we have a distribution reference, which we can look up by path. So in the base repository class, service class, we also are able to create repositories because they are not typed. We can update a distribution, and updating the distribution simply takes a distribution and updates its publication. The refresh distribution takes takes multiple paths, and for each path it either updates or creates the distribution. We can also create a version in this abstract class, and we can list paths if we are using, or if the repository is meant to be unprotected, we can expose it via HTTP, otherwise just HTTPS, and this may differ for like Docker and things. We can also create a distribution. So we first call it to Pulp to create the distribution and then create the distribution reference. And then here we have some common remote options. This is similar to the importer options of Pulp 2. We will always want checksum validation, and then SSL validation is based on the root repo. The name, again, comes from the backend object name, and then URL from the root URL. We also have upstream username and password options, and then we merge in the SSL remote options. And then the SSL remote options, this again mirrors the Pulp 2 importer options that you'll see in those service classes. We're passing in an SSL client cert, client key, or CA certificate. And it differs based on if it's Red Hat or a custom repo. Moving down to the Pulp 3 repository file class, so this is the file service class. These are things that are very specific to file. We creating a remote. Remotes are for syncing. So here we're reaching out to the file create and calling update attributes on the repo to save the remote href. That's important. For file, for the file repos, we actually have to add a Pulp manifest onto the end of the URL. This is different from Pulp 2 to Pulp 3. Pulp 3 allows the user to specify the sort of metadata to read, and eventually we would like the user to specify that, but I'm not sure at what point we'll change that. You can update a remote. We've also got a sync here. This was mostly for my testing. And we can create a publisher, which again is file specific. We're again using that backend object name. And then we update the repository reference to save the publisher href. And then finally, we can create a publication. So moving on down, we've added 2 new fields to the repository type class. We've added a Pulp 3 service class and a Pulp 3 plugin, which I mentioned the Pulp 3 plugin before. This is the plugin that unlocks this type. And in our database schema, we've got a Katello, the distribution references, which I said was the path in the href. We've also got a repository reference, which has a repository href and a publisher href, as well as referencing a content view and root repository. And then we've got 3 new attributes on repository, a remote, publication, and version hrefs. And I may make a third video talking about these things, and I will post that if I do. We were adding the Pulp 3 service class here, or sorry, Pulp 3 feature for smart proxies here. And then finally, in the file repo type, we are adding the Pulp 3 service class as well as the Pulp 3 plugin name. Now moving on, I showed this slide previously, and I've actually in this slide filled out everything. So we have the repo create API. We're creating a file repo. This is triggering the Katello repository create action, which is triggering the Katello Pulp selector action, reaching out to the smart proxy, determining, oh, this is a Pulp 3 action that needs to be done. So then that's triggering the Pulp 3 orchestration creation action, which as part of that triggers all these create remotes, create publishers, and more, which then calls out to the Pulp 3 service classes. Hopefully this was somewhat clear walking through this pull request. Again, there's tests to add and some fixes that we found as going through this. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.